So good morning all. Today we are going to be discussing the feature that is going to be added in an object-oriented programming called C++. The concept is called namespace. So what is namespace? Why we are using namespace concept in C++? What is the role of namespace? What is its advantage and how we are going to be accessing in a program, and what exactly that namespace is going to be linked in object-oriented programming concept called C++. As we all know, C++ is an extension of C programming, or C with classes is called C++, and C++ is also considered as an example of object-oriented programming language, right? So next we move on to what exactly namespace and usage of namespace in C++, and again its working principle in a C programming language. Before looking with exact concept of C++, just we'll go with a simple example, a simple C programming example, or we can consider C, C++, anything, but C doesn't support namespace concept. I'll be go with an simple application without header file. I'm just representing a small application program. So here we are declaring two variables, and one is of integer data type and another is of a double data type, and two values is of same data type. Two data type what I defined for a variable, and two variable which is having a same name but data type is different, right? And once you compiled with any compiler like C, C++ or anything, so once if you executing a program and user is going to be gets with and compiler error. Reason is nothing but the single variable cannot be used more than once. Single variable name value is a single variable name that cannot be used more than one data type. So according to an example, value is a single variable name, but it is associated with two different data type, integer as well as double. So hence the compiler will raises an error, and specifically the value as a previous declaration as int value, hence the scope defined is restricted only for a one entity. So in simple term, user cannot declare a single variable name for multiple data type, means name can be represent only one entity, the value is represented only for one entity. Hence the given program shows an error by any compiler, any C++ compiler. If you run the same program, the common error is going to be specified. It is a scope, or we can call it as an previously it is already declared, and it cannot be verified in terms of two different data type name with the different data types. So using namespace, user can create, but how to avoid this condition? So even though user want to have same name with a different data type, and assume some examples like user is writing a program which consists of n number of modules, and if n number of modules are there, how we can make use of a single variable name, right? So that process is implemented in C++ by using a concept called as namespace. So using a namespace, user can create two different variables or member function which is having same name. User can create two variables or member functions, but it is having the same name, as in case in the previous example, value is the same. So, and assign to two different data type, and again you can assign to two different functions, right? So by using namespace concept, user can allowed to use the common name. By using namespace concept, user is allowed to use a common name. So that is an one advantage of namespace. That example gives what exactly namespace and why we are using namespace, and with definition we are going to be seeing in the next application site. What is namespace? Namespace is used to define scope where identifiers like variable, function, classes, etc. are going to be declared. What exactly scope? Scope is nothing but region, or we can call it as a space, or we can call it as a way in which how it will be allowed to access. If I take identifiers is just like a variables I can call, or function I can call, or classes I can call. So what extent I can access that variable, what extent that function is allowed to access in different function, and what extent I can use that particular object in particular class. So that gives a scope, means the region or area under which the particular identifiers can access this nothing but namespace. And the main purpose of using namespace is to avoid or prevent an ambiguity, or we can call it as a complexity, that may occur when two identifiers have same name. So that is one of the main purpose of the namespace is to prevent or to avoid the collision that may occur when the two identifier which is having a same name. That's the main purpose of your identifiers. And again, it is used to avoid naming collision or conflicts in a program. So sometimes if you want to avoid a naming collision or conflicts in a program, as a user we'll be using and declaring a namespace concept. That's a basic definition exactly what namespace is. Next we move on to one simple case study, and in that case study we'll just identify how to use a namespace concept and with some simple functionality application will program. So consider one simple example where two function which is having a same name called test, and again the test will perform any task. Some assume it is performing a linear search, assume it is performing a factorial of a number or Fibonacci series, or again you can consider as any algorithmic approach like a knapsack problem, greedy method, dynamic programming, divide and conquer, decrease and conquer, any type of particular task will be there, right? But we are assigning with the same name. If that is a case, if you are implementing the two function name which is having the same name called test, and each will perform a different task, how we can avoid an ambiguity, how we can avoid a naming collision. So in order to prevent that ambiguity or a complexity or a collision while calling one of the two functions, user can declare them in a two separate namespace. Even though if user is required with the same function name, but user has to define in the separate namespaces, two separate namespaces. If that is the case, namespace concept is going to be implemented for a common name, and again it is going to be implemented for common function, different applicational program, and any applications you can use it just to avoid a collision. That is very important case study. And again, if you are using with any particular function, and how the syntax has to be. So basically namespace and class look similar, only thing is nothing but keyword is different. When defining a class in C++, we are using class as a keyword, but defining a namespace we are using namespace as a keyword. Same thing as class will contain a class name, namespace is also contain a namespace name. So very important. And when you're using a namespace for a global access, we are using a special operator called scope resolution operator. So 2 colon is represented as an scope resolution operator. So consider the case study in that. Suppose one of the function is declared in a namespace name1 and another is declared in name2, then how to access two different namespaces, even though if it is contain common function name, same function name. So if that is the case, you have to specify the particular namespace under which you are defined, followed by scope resolution operator, then followed by method or function name. If that is the case, if user is representing the syntax like that, then it is specifically access a test method which is defined in particular namespace. For example, if user want to access namespace defined in name2, then user has to specify the syntax name2 scope resolution operator test, then specifically test defined in namespace 2 is going to be accessed. Similarly, if user want to access the namespace defined in namespace 1, then user has to specify syntax name1 scope resolution operator test. So that will give the specification of exactly syntax has to be used, and this will give just an overview of the case study how the namespace can be implemented. Next we move on to how we can access a namespace. So whenever you are implementing any programming language, accessing plays an important role. How to access a particular namespace. So C++ uses a standard namespace called std. So whenever you are writing any C++ program, the common name we are writing using namespace std. Using namespace std, all acts as a keyword. Using is also keyword, namespace is also keyword, std is also a keyword. And using keyword followed by anything if you specified particular namespace that you are incorporating into a particular C++ program, means all the standard namespaces that is incorporated into your program by using directive. So in some application we are calling using is an assembler directive, and namespace is a keyword, and std is a namespace name. Similarly, user can also create its user defined name. If you want to create your own user defined name, namespace followed by name, and again if you want to access that in a particular header file as a program, same thing, using namespace you have to give it a particular namespace name. So that's a common syntax we are following in each and every program in a C++ implementation. So if you're using standard where all the built-in classes and functions are declared, hence user use the statement as using namespace std at the beginning of the C++ program, where exactly you are using the namespace called it as std. Std stands for a standard. The standard is nothing but it's a namespace name. So that is the syntax of accessing your namespace. And next we will move on to what is the syntax of representing the namespace. So if user want to define their own namespace, user defined namespace, and as I told, similar to class, namespace is also having the same syntax, but only difference is nothing but class name and namespace name. And class name will contain the class name, namespace is also will contain the namespace, and within that namespace we are representing a logic. Or within a class we are having a data member and member function, within a namespace we are having the logic of the namespace or accessing the label or a value or a variable or a functionality. Anything user can define based on the requirements, user will be defining a syntax or logic within a namespace that is going to be defined. And whenever you are accessing the namespace keyword, the syntax is common as I defined in the previous slide. Namespace name followed by scope resolution operator, followed by the particular member name. So that will access the particular member. Or you can also specify the function name, or you can also specify user defined function, or you can also specify unnamed namespace. Similarly, you can also use it for an unnamed namespace concept also, right? And just consider one simple example. And here we have created a namespace called sample, and within that we have added some syntax, logical, application program, and we have declared one simple variable called it as a, and within that we are writing one method or a function called it as a sum, which is of a data type integer return type, and again it consists of two argument or a parameter or a variable called it as x as well as y, and return x plus y, you are writing the value after processing the data. So assume that the variable a and function sum can be accessed in the program. We are having the specific syntax. So sample scope resolution operator a is equal to 5. Similarly, int x equal to sample scope resolution operator sum 5 comma 9. So two different ways we can access. So whenever you are accessing in a program the variable a and the function sum, we are having specific syntax. So if you want to add some value, because a is a member that is defined in a namespace sample. So if you want to allocate or initialize a value, so the simple syntax is simple sample colon colon, that is scope resolution operator a, and we are assigning a value 5. And similarly, if you want to access a function, the function or a method, that is a sum, again it accepts two parameter 5 and 9. Again you will be accessing and redirecting to a scope resolution operator followed by the namespace name. Then we are allocating to int x. So this is the basic syntax we are going to be using when you're implementing your C++ program with the help of syntax namespace concept. So consider another example program. Hash include iostream is an header file, and followed by we are representing using namespace std as an declaration part. Then followed by we are creating user defined namespace name called it as first function, and within that function we are writing one simple method or a logic that is of printing C++ program with a function name called as func, and in the second function as a namespace with the name, again we are writing the same name as a func function, and again but we are printing the different text Java program, and followed by we are terminating the program. And then we are using a main method, and within that main method, as I told, we are using that name of the namespace followed by scope resolution operator. If it is a member, specify the member. If it is a function or method, specify a function, right? And again we will be calling with the second namespace function. And in the initially I told you, if it is a common function name, if it is a common value, so then you have to define separately with a particular namespace. Then we can avoid the conflict, we can avoid the collision, thereby the program efficiency will be increased, and we can avoid the confusion for the compiler. Instead of making confusion to the compiler and creating a syntax error or logical error, we can define and declare it in a separate namespace, right? And afterwards we are identifying with the logic, then output is going to be generated C++ program followed by Java program, right? So this is an impact where exactly we are using the namespace concept, and in C++ program it's a new feature, and this feature is not available in C programming languages. But to avoid any namespace collision, collision or any type of ambiguity, we are using namespace concept. Next we move on to users and advantage. And namespace is a declarative region. So when you are using a namespace, it acts as a declarative section, declaration section, and that has to be defined in initial of the program or starting of the program. And as I told, it is provides some scope to the identifiers. It has to be defined within that, right? And there's one users. And the second one, namespaces are used to organize the code into logical groups. Means we can make some logical entities, we can group it as a logical data, and thereby we can avoid the collision. And whenever the base code are going to be used in a multiple libraries also, it is especially useful, and specifically we can implement an efficient and effective program for implementation of particular logic. And again namespaces can be defined and extended to multiple files. For example, if you have defined the namespace for one file, and again you can use it in another file just by incorporating previously defined namespace into a new file. That is the usage, that extension. Means we can define the namespace in one file, and that file can be extended to another file, right? So very important, namespace can be defined and extended to multiple files, and that logic can be accessed in a new file that is already defined in your previous file. So these are all the basic users where exactly we can use it on your namespace concept. So these are basic program examples how namespace can be implemented. Just practice all the logical programs and work it with any type of C++ compiler and verify it with any logic. If you have any queries, just share it with the YouTube channel, and again we'll come back with the solutions, and any queries also you can revert back. I'll be available, and you can also interact with me.